several years I posted videos called Archery Tip of the Day, and over the last couple of years I haven't been able to do many of those, but I've been wanting to get back into doing them, providing tips for folks that are trying to work their way down this archery journey, their own personal archery journey. And so I recently solicited to folks, hey, what would you like to see? What do you want a video on? What would be helpful? And I got a ton of responses, but one really caught my attention, and it was, hey, how about doing a video on how to go from being a good archer to a great archer? And I thought about that. I thought, you know, that's a great topic to talk about. More academic than out in the backyard or on the range shooting a bow. But I think incredibly important. There's a lot to this idea of how do you get pretty good, maybe you plateau, or you're good enough that you're somewhat content with your shooting, but you'd really like to take it to that next level. Now this may not be for everybody. I have literally shot on the range with folks that were okay shooters, but they were completely satisfied with where they were. If that's you, okay, you can stop the video now. But for those who'd like to maximize their own personal potential, see just how good they can become, this video I hope will help you down that journey. Nothing novel. As I tell business leaders all over the country, I'm not going to tell you anything you probably don't know. The question is, do you have the drive, the motivation, and the mental attitude, mental approach to taking it to that next level? It'll take, as you'll see later, total commitment to get there. So let's dive right in. And the first thing that I would tell you about archery is really still in a quote from my good friend Rod Jenkins, and that is, shooting a bow and arrow is really simple. It just seems hard to consistently do it the right way every time. It really is. It's a simple process, and you need a few things in order to do that. So let's take a look at those. So let's start with just talking about the basic fundamentals of archery. You know, shooting a bow and arrow is not overly complex at all. In fact, it's simple. But sometimes our head gets in the way, our stubbornness, our lack of an open mind. And we're going to talk a little bit about all of those things. You know, I say to shoot a bow and arrow, all you really need is a RAT. And that is obviously an acronym for 1, a repeatable shot sequence, 2, an aiming system, and 3, a tuned bow and arrow. Now, unfortunately, folks oftentimes get these out of order. And Rod would tell you, as he coaches all over the country, one of the things that we seem to become obsessed about is tuning the bow. And unfortunately, until you have a repeatable shot sequence, you can't tune the bow. It's hard to tune a bow and arrow when no two arrows are shot exactly the same. And so we think perhaps our problem with accuracy or consistency is the bow and the arrow, when in reality it's most commonly we don't have a repeatable shot sequence. We're not shooting the bow the same every time. Again, basic fundamentals. If you execute the exact same shot sequence every time, no matter the distance you're shooting, the arrow lands in the same spot each time. It's when we induce variables into the shot sequence, we're collapsing a little bit. Our draw length isn't consistent. Our grip on the bow isn't exactly the same. Our release isn't consistent. All of those things, just minute little changes in our shot sequence, changes the impact of the arrow when it gets down to the target. So the first thing we need to do is build a repeatable shot sequence. Now I highly recommend, if at all feasible, if there's any way you can, the best way to get this down is to get a coach. You can use a video recorder and watch yourself and see minute differences in your shot sequence. But nothing replaces a coach, and even a coach using video is the most preferred in my opinion. But where do you learn to build that repeatable shot sequence? You got a lot of options. If you got a coach nearby, that's great. If you can get a clinic as kind of a boot camp, Rod, you put together 12 folks, Rod will come out and do a clinic for you. And if not, none of those are feasible, then go right now online and buy Masters of the Barebow Volume 3 and just watch from start to finish Rod explaining with Denny how to put a shot sequence together. That is as good a start point on video as I know to recommend for you. But first and foremost, we've got to spend the time and energy ensuring that we're shooting the bow consistently the same each time. And then we can pick an aiming system. I don't care what your aiming system is. To be honest with you, gapping, I don't always use gapping. As most of you know, I string walk a lot when I'm, and sometimes I shoot instinctive, what you would call instinctive. But primarily I gap and string walk, so I'm using the tip of the arrow to aim. Look, I can take any of your bows out there as long as I can pull it. Some of you shoot 60, 65 pound bows, so I couldn't do much with that. But I can take your bow and walk out to the bales, and in less than 30 minutes, I can know where to aim the bow on all my targets. It's a very simple process, and I've got videos on here that shows you how I go about setting that up. Master the Bear Bow, I think volume 1 or 2, Rod shows how he sets up his gapping process. But it doesn't take for a few minutes to figure out where to aim the arrow. Again, if you're shooting the bow the same each time, the arrow's going to go the same spot. You just go to 5 yards, 10 yards, 15 yards, 20 yards, shoot a few arrows, determine the gap. You can scribble it on a napkin and walk off to the targets, and from there on out, you know where to aim the bow. So it's not hard once we've got a repeatable shot sequence. And finally, of course, a tuned bow. As I say, people want to jump to this. It's important that you have a tuned bow. Unfortunately, some folks struggle with this because they're playing around with things like extreme forward center arrows. I mean, guys, shooting 300 or 400 grains up front on an arrow. Oftentimes, it'll shoot stiff when it's actually overly weak, ridiculously weak. This is hard to tune these arrows when we get them way out of whack in terms of where the center of gravity is on the arrow itself. Not saying you can't do it. I'm just saying that you have to be a pretty good tuner in order to take an arrow that is essentially out of tune and then tune it, make it shoot well out of your bow. But we want to get it close enough, and then we can fine tune as our shot sequence improves. So that's all we really need fundamentally is a RAT, repeatable shot sequence, an aiming system, and a tune bow. But there's, really you can get to that point if you commit to the process and do your work. You can get to that point relatively quickly. But there's something else that really stands in our way, in my belief at least, when we go from good to great. If you can master the RAT, you're a good archer. I would consider you a good archer, most all of you, if you'll put the time in and master this. But the next piece, it exists between our ears. It's our mental approach, and that is the limiting factor to so many folks. So let's take a look at that. When we talk about the mental approach, number one, we have to have an open mind, especially in the resurgence of the traditional archery. Really, when the term traditional archery came about, it was when folks were, we had left the recurve and longbow world, and we'd gone to the compounds as a society, and then there in the early 90s, a group of folks really wanted to go back old school, I guess you could say, but get back to their roots, and the term was born traditional archery to distinguish it between modern compounds and traditional bows, long bows, self bows, recurves. And at that time, a lot of folks fell in love with this idea of traditional archery, and it became a way in which they kind of identified themselves. It was who they were. It was how they dressed, what they wore to shoot. It became this kind of whole of character thing versus just archery, and the tool they chose to use was a longbow, recurve, or self bow. A lot of those folks were very closed-minded. They had this preconceived notion of how you were supposed to shoot a bow and arrow. And those folks frustrated me. As they came up in shoots and they'd see me, string walking, gapping, shooting 3 under versus split finger, even if you were shooting more accurately than them, they had this idea in their mind that that's how you were supposed to shoot a bow. And no offense to those who still choose to do this, to me, the 3-under, split finger, string walking, hey, it's just a place to put your fingers on the string. I'm about shooting accurately. I'm about consistently putting the arrow in the center of what I'm aiming at. And in order to do that, I think you have to have an open mind. I heard a quote years and years ago, a closed mind is an enigma. Nothing ever gets in, but strange things are always coming out. And that's so true. I think you have to approach archery with a very open mind, willing to try new things. When I went down this road of, hey, I'm going to maximize my potential, I'm going to see just how good I can become as an archer, I started out by saying I'm going to try every aiming style that's out there. So I learned a gap, I learned a string walk, I learned a face walk. I would change tabs on a field range, go split finger for the 80 and the 70, and then 3-under for the other targets. So I was very open with the approach of what is the best way to approach the target to get the best results. And so you've got to be open, or you're never going to get from good to great. Open your mind. The second piece is an inquisitive and innovative approach to archery. Several years ago I interviewed barebow legend Denny Klein, who first won the NFAA Field Championships in 1972, beating out the legendary David Hughes. And as I interviewed Denny, he said, people get frustrated about folks tinkering around with their bows and all that stuff, and that's always been going on. And he said, back in the early 70s, he said we would go shoot the national championship, and then everybody would go off and try to find an advantage, a way to shoot a little bit better. Back then, Denny came up, he and Harold Groves created the first overdraw, because they were shooting those big heavy arrows with light bows and lobbing them in there for the long target. So they came up with this idea of, hey, we can reduce the mass weight of the arrow by shortening it and creating an overdraw. And so I think we have to have inquisitive minds and an innovative approach for how we can shoot better within the rules of the game that you're going to shoot. Now, if you don't shoot tournament, you don't have to worry about it. You can do whatever you want to. I have done a video, and I advocate when people are struggling for hunting. I think it makes you a more ethical hunter if you're having trouble with wounding deer, the fixed crawl. Obviously, you can't use a fixed crawl in a 3D tournament anywhere, but for hunting, it is an innovative way to help you be more accurate and more lethal in your archery. So I think we have to open our mind up, and then we have to try things. We have to experiment and find out what works best for us given the game that we're pursuing. And that often varies. You'll see guys that shoot at the top of the 3D game when they shoot feet of field or NFAA indoors. We tune our bows very differently. We shoot completely different rigs for indoors versus field versus 3D. It's a totally different setup because it's a totally different game. We're looking for if you're gapping, shooting a traditional class or longbow, self-bow in the 3D world, and your max range of your target's 30 yards, then you want your point on to be pretty close to 25, 30 yards. And so you have to set the bow up to do that. That same setup I don't hunt with because the arrow is not perfectly tuned in that case. Indoors, we detune our bows. I mean, we're shooting logs down there, shooting slow. You want your point on at 20. It's just been proven that if you can aim with the tip of the arrow right on the dot, that you consistently score higher. And so it's not a rig, again, that we would hunt with. It's the tool that we need to maximize our potential at the game we're playing. And so you have to experiment and try these things in order to go from good to great. The final piece is total commitment. Look, if you take any of the top shooters, the folks that we look at online, we see the results online, or we go to a shoot and see them traditional worlds or something like that, the John Demmers, the Dwayne Martins, the Calvin Smocks, Alan Eagleton, all of these guys, and I can't name everybody, but those folks that consistently win, look, they don't shoot recreationally, okay? These guys are committed. They shoot every day. The year going into the first year I won the IBO Worlds, I shot 400 arrows a day for a year. I bet I didn't miss 10 days all year. And that's hours of shooting. But it's not just shooting. It's shooting good arrows. I see folks get down on the bales and they'll try to shoot great shots, and then we walk off on the 3D range and they start flinging arrows. And you got to remember that every shot you shoot in a bow and arrow, you're reinforcing something. You're either reinforcing a good shot sequence that you perfected on the bales and down on the flat range, or you're reinforcing a bad habit. And so if you want to go from good to great, you have to reinforce the positive. It has to be that shot sequence. That means don't get rushed. That means you don't go out just flinging arrows. And that doesn't mean you can't have fun. It just means you take the time and execute the shot the way you have trained yourself and prepared to shoot the good shot. You can't afford to go out and just fling arrows. That's it's going to reinforce something bad, or you're going to create a new habit that then you're going to have to work on overcoming. But you've got to be totally committed. You've got to go from good to great. You've got to decide that you are going to pursue that with everything you've got, and that means everything that I've mentioned above. That means having an open mind. That means trying new things. That means absolutely perfecting a repeatable shot sequence and then reinforcing it day in and day out, year round. I would come in sometimes, hadn't been able to shoot during the day, it'd be dark, I'd go to the basement and spend an hour shooting blank bell, just working on the hand position or the release, or whatever aspect of the shot I thought needed focused on for that day. And that's the level of commitment it takes to go from good to great. Again, some of you are probably satisfied with where you're at. If you are, that's good. But the guy who responded to me that wanted to know how to go from good to great, I'll tell you, you've got to commit. You got to want it. So that's what I think it takes. I think you have to work on all of those aspects to take your archery from good to maximizing your potential, which is great for you. But look, we're not all equally talented. I tell business leaders all the time when we talk about talent management, and just coincidentally, I'm quoting Jim Collins as the right person in the right seat on the bus, because we're not all equally talented. We're not all going to collect belt buckles from world championship victories like John Demmer or Dwayne Martin. We're just not. The reality is, I tell them, if we took the local 5th grade class, just take those kids to the gym, put them on the free throw line, line them up and hand them a basketball. 3 or 4 of those kids are going to dribble the ball, look at the goal, set their feet, and with incredible form and mechanics, they're going to shoot. And just like Steph Curry, nothing but net. 3 or 4 of those kids are going to dribble just a little bit awkward. They're going to look at the goal, and they're going to shoot. It's going to hit the rim. Maybe it'll go in, maybe not. But they're going to hit the rim. Some of those kids, 2 or 3, maybe 4, they're not even going to hit the backboard. And a certain percentage of those kids, no matter how much you coach them, no matter how much you work on mechanics, form, they're never going to shoot 70% from the free throw line. They're just not. And that's why we can't measure ourselves against others. For me, whether it's athletics, I was a long distance runner, I'm a cyclist, I've shot archery, leadership, we can't measure ourselves against other people. For me, it's about maximizing your own personal potential. And so when I went down this archery journey, it was about be the best version of Jimmy Blackman I can be. And that meant that I focus on the things I've shared with you today. I wish you the best of luck as you pursue your archery journey, and I hope you can take your game from good to great.